to study your word. We ask you guide us now, and as we do investigate another portion of your scriptures, guide our thinking, guide our discussion as we do that. Again, we thank you for your goodness, and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me welcome you both physically and electronically to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, Louisiana, on the 11th day of January 2026. We are beginning, we're actually continuing our discussions in 2 Corinthians, and we're going to begin to look at a new chapter. We're going to look at chapter 9, and we're only going to do the first 5 verses. So, if you remember, we talked about last week that we posed the question, was Corinth the first church that Paul addressed regarding this contribution? And we saw that there were a number of other churches that he approached before he approached Corinth. And then we also posed the question, why was this collection necessary? And we saw that there were a number of economic and societal factors going on in Jerusalem that required this contribution to be collected. And we also saw that there were some spiritual or theological factors that went into that Paul was trying to build a bridge to establish unity between the Gentile churches and the mother church of Jerusalem, which was primarily Jews that had been converted. So we saw there were some other factors other than just the physical piece of it. So that brings us to chapter 9. Like I said, we're only going to address 5 verses. And we'll start with verse 1. So let me start there. This is chapter 9, verse 1. It said, "Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry of the saints." Now notice what he says in this verse, and notice what he does not say. Look at the very end of the verse, to write to you about what? The ministry for the saints. Now we're going to come back to that. We're going to unpack that a little bit in a little bit. But it's interesting to note what he does not say. We also know that the entire chapter of chapter 8 has to do with this contribution. It has to do with giving, and it has to do with the relationship of giving to God's glory. We're going to come back to that as well. So, now beginning in verse 1 of chapter 9, what's the first word? Now. We'll get to 4 in a minute. Now is a time phrase. In this text, in this context, it connects what we've seen in chapter 8 to what Paul is going to begin to talk about in chapter 9. Now he says it's superfluous. That has the sense of being unnecessary, if we want to put that in kind of our language. So he's saying it's not necessary for me to go back and talk about this contribution anymore, because I've already done that, and we've seen that. But it also carries the sense that he is going to begin to talk about some other things. So let's put this in context. We spent a lot of time last week looking at context. So let's put this into a more immediate context. And let's go back to chapter 8, verse 24. Because remember now, we're connecting what he's going to begin to talk about to stuff that we've already seen. Verse 24, chapter 8 says, "So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. Now we need to parse out some of these pronouns. Okay? Is that all right? To help us put this back into a more immediate context. So it says, give proof before the churches. What churches? What churches is he talking about? The Macedonian churches. Okay. For your love. Who is your? Remember, who's he writing to? The Corinthians. So your has reference to the Corinthians. And conjunctive of our boasting. Our who? Huh? Who is our? Paul. Yeah, well, Paul and his companions, Titus and others. About you. Again, who is you? You who? The Corinthians. To these men. And who are these men? Yeah, this is the men appointed from Macedonia. So we get a frame in the last part of chapter 8 that continues in chapter 9. Okay? So let's begin to unpack verse 1 of chapter 9. And we've already talked about it being superfluous, unnecessary, if we want to say that. For me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. Now that's an interesting phrase, because notice what he does not identify. He identifies it as a ministry for these saints, but he does not say anything about Jerusalem. And we'll come back to that in a minute as well. So, okay, we said now is the time phrase. Well, I'm sorry. Let me move on here a little bit. In verse 2, what's the first word in verse 2? Well, it's for. Now, that grammatically that gets a little complicated, but this for connects verse 2 again back to what we've already seen in chapter 8. And it begins to identify some of what Paul is going to begin to talk about. He's not going to talk about this ministry as such, but he's going to talk about some other things, and this begins to identify what he's going to talk about. So in verse, it also can kind of give us, if we're going to outline these 5 verses, which we typically wouldn't do, but if we were going to do that, it begins to give us an outline of what he is going to begin to talk about. Verses 1 and 2 is the first point that he's going to talk about. And he's going to talk about his boasting about the Corinthians. Then verses 3 and 4 deal with the effect that this boasting may have had on him and the Macedonians. And then verse 5, he talks about the concept or the means by which they're going to give this contribution. So we have a sense of an outline here. And as I said, we would notice that he did not say anything about Jerusalem. Interestingly, in the Corinthian letters, that is Jerusalem, Paul mentions Jerusalem only once, and that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 3. So if we tie that back to, it says there's no need to talk about that, he's again saying that there's not necessary for me to identify where this is going. Okay? Verse 2, 4, another 4. We have a 4 in verse 1. It is not necessary for me to write. Verse 2 says, "For I know your readiness," or your eagerness, some translations say, "of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia." Now, this carries the sense that Paul's admiration for their who, Corinthians, enthusiasm, or their enthusiastic response to the collection was so great that he boasts about that to the Macedonians. And he compliments the Corinthians. He says, I know your eagerness, or ESV is, I know your readiness. Now, we also know from other places and from other things we've studied, we know that Paul was a man of words, right? He wrote a bunch of letters. He wrote a bunch of words. And he also preached a bunch of stuff. So he was a man of words, but he was also a man of action. And he taught his followers to be the same. Now, we're not going to chase this cross-reference, but 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, and chapter 11, verse 1, give us that information, that he's telling his followers, not only what I say, but what I do, and I expect you to do the same thing. Now, this is the concept we're going to see here that we're going to trace, is the difference between words and actions. And in this second verse, he says, I know your readiness. Readiness is a word. It is not action. They are ready to do something, which by implication they have not done yet. And again in verse 2, the readiness of which I boasted about you to the people of Macedonia. So he's saying here that it's not merely words from the Corinthians that he wants, but some form of action. And he uses the members of the church in Corinth as an example to the churches in Macedonia, primarily Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. So he's been boasting repeatedly about the Corinthians during his stay in Macedonia. He's praising the Corinthians for their willingness, their readiness, their eagerness to give. So the Corinthian enthusiasm inspired the Macedonians to contribute generously to this cause. We see that in chapter 8, verse 2. Now we have to think about his boasting, and we've seen this before. It's not he attributes this not to. Well, I have to see how I phrase this. He's boasting, but he's not boasting about himself. Remember? He's boasting about the grace of God that worked in the hearts of the people in Macedonia. We saw that in chapter 8, verse 2. So he attributes his boasting, not his boasting, but again to God's grace. So these people, the Macedonians, imitated the eagerness of the Corinthians' words, and they went further and took action and began to collect this contribution. Now, the deeds of the Macedonians in this collection became an example to the Corinthians. See, we connect the dots, it comes full circle. And it completes the circle that Paul had started about this collection. It is now nearly, not completely, but is now nearly complete. So. Okay, next phrase in verse 2 says, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. See, so he connects what the Macedonians are actually doing back to what the Corinthians said they were going to do, and by implication had not done yet. Now we talked about Achaia last week, so we need to think a little bit about where that is or what that is. Again, he says, the verse in ESV says, saying that Achaia. He could be translated, said, I was saying that Achaia. Achaia was a Roman province that encompassed all of southern Greece. And Corinth was the capital of that province. So he's he's being more inclusive here. He's not talking exclusively about Corinth, but he's talking about that whole area and the churches in that area. The church in Corinth served as the mother church for the congregations in this surrounding area. We see that in Romans 16, verse 1. So, as I said, he's being more inclusive because he mentions the process, not only the city. So the people in the church at Corinth and in the surrounding area had been ready to give to this collection since the previous year. We see that in chapter 8, verse 10. But apparently, something happened that detracted from their enthusiasm. It caused a delay in this contribution. Remember, we talked about this back in chapter 2. Anybody remember chapter 2? What was the delay that detracted from the Corinthians' enthusiasm about collecting this contribution? Anybody remember? What was the major contribution? What was the major difficulty or thing that the Corinthian church was having to deal with?
Someone they were having discipline?
Huh?
Was it someone they were having discipline?
Yeah, for what?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that whole thing about this guy and his father's wife. You know, we detailed all of that, the language and whatever. But apparently, that having to deal with that controversy detracted from their enthusiasm to actually go ahead and start the collection. Now, he doesn't address that specifically here, but he has addressed that in both 1 Corinthians and also in 2 Corinthians. And if we take that in a negative sense, then it would seem to detract from what Paul has already said about the Corinthians, because he's been bragging about them, so, or boasting.
Backing up, is that what he's doing?
Well, it would seem that way. And we're gonna detail that out in just a minute. But his words here are actually pretty positive, because his words is that the Corinthians induced many people in Macedonia to donate. See, there's a connection. So. We also know primarily from last week, that this project, this collection, involved nearly all of the churches that Paul had founded. We detail that out. Remember, it's Antioch and a whole bunch of others. Before he first broached this project to the Corinthians. So the churches in Asia, and these included a bunch of them: Ephesus, Tychicus, Triumphus, and then last of all, Corinth and Macedonia, which, as he boasts about that, the indication is that his confidence in the Corinthians has not been shaken, even though there was a period where it was interrupted. So if we take that as in a complete sense, his words then are positive, not critical or negative. So his confidence hasn't been shaken, and he is gratified by the outcome of this undertaking. See, all of that in verse 2. So, now, verse 3. First word in verse 3. In the ESV, I don't know, if you're reading something else, it may not be the same. Huh? But. Now, what do we know about buts grammatically? Yeah, it's typically a canceller. It typically cancels what follows what comes before. So, if we take it in that frame, then that we're back to this thing about him being negative. If we read that as a verse that tends to contradict what he's already been saying, then why is he sending brothers if he is boasting about the Corinthians' eagerness? Or why does he fear that the Corinthians will fail him? Or why is he casting doubt on their readiness? So what option do we have?
For one thing.
Well, yeah.
And so as they're getting ready, we know where they're going, but they don't seem to be getting the horses together and get on their way.
Yeah. But what happens if we read this but as and? Not but I am sending, I am sending the brothers. Now we're not supposed to change the grammar, but if we change the way that we think about the grammar, then perhaps we get a different perspective about what he is in fact writing. So verse 3, but I'm sending the brothers so that, term of conclusion, our boasting about you may not prove empty, or some translations say in vain, in this manner, so that, term of conclusion, you may be ready, as I said you would be. So we've got two terms of conclusion in one verse.
I have three. I have yet.
Hmm?
I have yet. Have I sent
Okay, what version are you reading?
King James?
KJV? Okay. So he's not contradicting anything. This is not to be read negatively, but again to be read positively.
Yeah, it seems it's not negative, even though it does contain a warning in these. But I think to your point, I think that everything he's saying is, because I believe in you so much and that we're gonna do this, I'm willing to commit extra resources to this project
Yeah.
that will not only, help you complete it, but will also encourage you and build you up. These people that he's sending that aren't just, like, so we talked before, they're not just bodyguards
Yeah, to tag on to that, he's not sending these brothers to Corinth to be administrators or controllers. He's sending them rather to continue and accentuate glorifying God. Remember, all of chapter 8 has to do connecting giving to God's glory. So this is a continuation of that. And to continue God's glory, he's saying that that his boasting in the Corinthians might not be in vain or not be to any avail. Now we also have to do some thinking about this term boasting. And we're not going to chase all these references, but we see them in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 31. We'll see it again in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 17. That what Paul talks about when he talks about boasting, it's boasting in the Lord, not his personal ego-satisfying boasting. So his boasting is directed first toward God, and then to express Paul's thankfulness for that, and then secondly toward the churches for their mutual edification. So we have to be careful how we read boasting without putting our interpretation on it, because he's not bragging. He's boasting in and about God. Okay? So the brothers that are going to be sent to Corinth have heard Paul boasting about the Corinthians and also about the rejoicing in Macedonia. So now they're going to travel to Corinth to continue this boasting and continue the rejoicing in God. So by sending the brothers, Paul wants to see that the Corinthians are true to the words that they have spoken. Therefore, the delegates go to Corinth to bolster the eagerness of the Corinthians. Now, the sense is the Corinthians are still very positive about all this. They're all very eager. But the implication seems to be they have not yet actually started the collection. The words have not yet been transferred into actions. So the brothers are not there to administer the contribution. They're not there to oversee any of that, but they are to encourage and bolster the Corinthians' eagerness to get off their seat and actually begin this collection. So in that sense, his words should be understood as understood positively, as words of encouragement. He's not doubting the readiness of the Corinthians, but he wants their zeal to be transferred into actions. Okay, verse 4. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and found out that you were not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. Second word in verse 4. One of my most favorite concepts. If. This is a conditional if, probably third-class conditional. And it has two senses here. First of all, it's a continuation of verse 3. It begins with words that express uncertainty. So at the time Paul is writing this, he's not certain who will accompany him. he's saying that somebody's going to go, but he's not saying who at this point. And then the other piece of the if is if the Macedonians join Paul and find the Corinthians unprepared, then blame would fall on this church. Now remember, one of the things that Paul is trying to accomplish is this bridge between the Gentile churches and the church in Jerusalem. It seems that he is also trying to bring unification to the Gentile churches. So if he goes to Corinth, or if these guys go to Corinth and they find Corinth unprepared, then that would bring blame on them, which would contradict his trying to unify all of the Gentile churches. So we've got a second conditional if. So he's trying to consolidate the unity and the harmony of the church, particularly Macedonian churches and Corinthian churches, but that would be expanded to all of the Gentile churches that are involved in this collection. So in that frame, it seems that he wants the Corinthian and the Macedonian churches to take a position of leadership in this project. Now we see that in Romans chapter 15, verse 26. So if the churches he established, or particularly the church he established in Corinth, should lag behind being prepared or being unprepared, then he would personally be greatly embarrassed. So he wants them to have this project completely finished by the time he and the Macedonians get there. Then the phrase, to say nothing of you for being so confident, it could be translated, we are, not to mention you, put to shame. Now, there's another sense here. He's being really diplomatic about this when he talks to the church at Corinth. And if we look at the language, he actually puts the onus on himself that I would be embarrassed, and then almost as an afterthought, so would you. So he's making the point, guys, this ain't going to be really good, but it's primarily on me, and then by extension, it's on you as well. Again, it's that concept of trying to unify, in the first instance, Macedonia and Corinth, but then more generally, all of these Gentile churches. So again, this is an example of his tact as he writes to this congregation. Okay, verse 5. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers, these are the Macedonian brothers, to go on ahead to you and to arrange in advance for the gift you promised, so that they may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. So the first phrase, so I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead. The concept seems to be that he had thought about this, and he decided that it was beneficial if they go on ahead of him before he gets there. Again, not to be overseers, but to bolster their enthusiasm to get this task done. So he's again careful about what he says. there are two unnamed brothers. Now remember who commissioned them? We talked about this earlier. Who were they commissioned by? The churches, not Paul. He did not pick these guys. The churches did. And they were to go and accompany Titus. So the concept here, the task is to help the Corinthians in the joyous task of completing the collection. They're not going to administer it. So that when Paul and the delegation from Macedonia arrive, everything will be ready. Again, in this overall frame of glorifying God. Then we would also notice his emphasis on the concept of before. This is mentioned 3 times in this verse. Go ahead of me in advance, beforehand. Now that's KJV. ESV doesn't say that specifically, but there's the same concept there. So he's placing the burden on the Corinthians, and he is fully assured that they will complete what they promised. Again, positivity with not any hint of negativity here. So he seems to indicate that the people of Corinth were not unwilling to give, but perhaps needed help in organizing the actual work of collecting these funds. And then the final phrase said, as a willing gift, not as an exaction. The word exaction has the sense of a bounty or a blessing. It's a blessing on your part, not as a mandate or a covetousness on Paul's part. That we're not exhorting you. We're not. What's the word I want? We're not extracting this from you. We're not drawing a complete blank. What word do I want? Force. Force. Yeah. Oh, come on. It's X something. Extortion. We're not extorting you to give this contribution, but we're framing it in the sense that this is a blessing. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So he's putting the emphasis on the grace of giving. So again, his remark is positive and not negative. Now, if we summarize these 5 verses, there are about 5 things that we can learn from this, from these 5 things that we can learn from these 5 verses. Isn't that interesting? That we can learn about, we can learn truths about giving. So let's go through these 5 things. From verse 1, we can know that this is a ministry. Now, in the immediate context here, the ministry is basically money. It's giving money. And as we apply that to our ministry here, that would include money, but it would include also a number of other things. It's our ministry in whatever form that takes to be used in the ministry of the church in whatever form that takes. So there's a dual concept here. It also carries the concept of complete involvement, complete cooperation of the entire body. in whatever form that takes. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's effort, and sometimes it's something else. But to accomplish the ministry of the church requires complete involvement of the entire body. Okay, from verse 2, we learn the second truth. It gives us an example of that others may stir us up to give generously. We may follow, as the Corinthians followed the example of the Macedonians to give generously. That may help us to see an example from somebody else to give generously. Okay, the third truth, which we see in verses 3 through 5, that our giving, in whatever form it takes, requires careful administration by others to make sure that it reaches its proper destinations. So we're not going to fall for a TV ad, send me $50 and I'll send you a prayer cloth, that kind of thing. We have to have careful administration of where these efforts and these funds are going. Okay, the fourth truth we have from verse 5. It's good to make considered, important word, considered promises to God and sometimes to others about what we intend to give. Remember, we're transferring words or intentions into action. Therefore, we should give careful consideration to what we say we're going to do or what we say we're going to give. And then the fifth truth that we can garner from this, we get from verse 2 and verse 5, that our giving should be, some translations say joyful, that our giving should be eager, should be enthusiastic, should be cheerful, and not with a grudging attitude or an unwillingness to give. So out of these 5 little verses, we can garner these 5 truths that help us to understand in that frame of glorifying God with our giving in whatever form that takes. Okay, thoughts, questions, comments? Anything further?
It reeks of wisdom.
Yeah. I have completed my 5 verses. Casey will pick up next week with, I don't remember what your pericope is, but it follows me, so I'm guessing it starts with verse 6. The rest of the chapter. Okay. Giving. Yeah. Okay, anything else before we wrap up? Okay, then we'll take a break and reassemble upstairs in about